Good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenue. Pour ceux et celles qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Monica Gatinger. Je suis directrice d'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique. And it gives us great pleasure to have this first Food for Thought session of the year today. We have an absolutely outstanding panel for you. We were just discussing this prior to the webinar getting started. We wanted to articulate a panel around COVID-19 that would be distinctive. And if there's one area that those who are involved with the ISSP are interested in, it deals with public trust and trust in experts and in expertise. We have an absolutely outstanding group of current members of the ISSP and also former students at the University of Ottawa affiliated with the Institute. We're just delighted to have you with us this afternoon. We will begin the session with the University of Ottawa's land acknowledgement. And I would like to encourage everybody to acknowledge the land from which they are gathering with us today. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you again for joining us today. This first Food for Thought of the year couldn't be more in line with the Institute's forthcoming strategic plan, which will be released next month. So for the next 5 years, the strategic vision of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, so this is sort of the sneak peek before it's officially released, focuses on helping Canada to transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time. And so that means, how do we rethink doing decision-making in an era of polarization, in an era of emerging and disruptive technologies, in an era of so many grand challenges before us, whether it's COVID-19, climate change, or other major issues that society is facing. And the Institute wants to be there to help the country and internationally to transform decision-making to meet those grand challenges. That's going to mean us focusing on a few key topic areas, one of which is public trust in experts and expert-based decision-making, the focus of our panel today. So we're really delighted to be able to kick off the year with a panel that's so aligned with our new strategic vision. Before we get going for today with our panel, it was really tough to put this panel together because we have so many members at the ISSP who address and deal with issues of public trust and confidence in their work. So what we thought we would do to try to encourage a little bit of additional participation from our membership was we asked a number of our members to identify one aspect of COVID-19 governance that has had an impact or is having an impact on public trust in expertise. And we recorded some short videos from a number of our members responding to that question. So we're going to show those now before we get into the panel. So Raphael, if you could show us the video.
Bonjour. L'éthique et l'utilisation des données probantes de la science ont été pour moi les choses les plus importantes durant la pandémie pour la prise de décision politique. Avoir tous les jours le directeur de la santé publique et le premier ministre, par exemple, au Québec, parler avec les citoyens et leur expliquer comment fonctionne la science, que son rythme n'est pas aussi rapide que celui des réseaux sociaux ou encore des nouvelles quotidiennes à la télé, ont été, je pense, des instruments futuristes qui pourront servir dans d'autres situations difficiles peut-être ou moins difficiles que nous aurons à traverser. Je crois que cette appropriation citoyenne est très importante aussi pour la participation de tous et toutes à la construction des politiques de santé publique. Merci. Au revoir.
I think one of the most important dimensions of COVID-19 governance that's helped build public trust has been the banding together of scientists across the country into very informal and sometimes formal networks, including things like the COVID-19 Canada Working Group, the Ontario Science Table, COVID-19 Science Table, and the BC COVID-19 Modeling Group. What's important about these is that it's scientists themselves acting independently of government, forming a grassroots effort to provide independent advice and make that advice and the analyses and data on which it rests publicly available. I think that's done almost more than anything to build public trust.
S'il y a des leçons à tirer de la gouverne de la COVID au Canada, je pense qu'il serait peut-être bien avisé d'être un peu plus humble et de regarder ce qui se passe ailleurs. Et je pense que le meilleur endroit peut-être où regarder aujourd'hui, c'est Taïwan, un pays de 23 millions d'habitants, au niveau de vie comparable à celui du Canada, et qui a très tôt pris des mesures très efficaces pour limiter la contagion, assurer la quarantaine des personnes qui étaient infectées, mais surtout assurer un traçage des personnes infectées et des mesures de confinement sans nuire à l'activité économique et sans limiter les libertés publiques. Alors donc, une importante leçon pour nous, pour les prochaines vagues de pandémie qui pourraient se produire à l'avenir.
Right. So the public, I think, has basically been split between kind of people who are putting a lot of faith in governments and so on to deliver vaccines because they're actually seeing like these effects, right? They're seeing shots in arms, we're seeing people protected and so on. This is, I think, a really important piece of it. At the same time, we're also seeing a lot of suspicion and there's a substantial amount of like anti-vaxxers around because it's been a growing movement over the past several decades, and this brings a lot of them to the fore because suddenly it's not so theoretical for them anymore, right? Or it's not just sort of like vaccines for kids that most people aren't sort of thinking about. It's suddenly vaccines for everyone, and there's potential for vaccine passports and things like that that might like play a role. And this is probably eroding trust more. So I think what's happening is it's splitting. So I think for me, I would say definitely the idea of vaccines, that are being delivered to a vast majority of Canadians is one of the things that's probably the most impactful. Even though it's a relatively recent one as far as COVID is concerned, I think that to me is one where we're really seeing it start. And I think we're going to see a lot more of it as we go on, especially if this is an ongoing thing, as it probably will be over many years.
If I'm asked to cite single aspect of COVID-19 governance that has been the most consequential for public trust and expertise in Canada, I would highlight the importance of providing trustworthy information. The public should be able to gather, collect, and seek information from sources that they find credible and sources that they find information to be trustworthy. Also, it is important for us to move beyond a one-size-fits-all approach to also include culturally and linguistically tailored and targeted messaging.
Wow, that gives you a tremendous taste of the diversity and caliber of expertise of our members. I'm so delighted that we were able to share that with you. So without further ado, we're going to move straight into our panel. I will be handing the floor now over to Dr. Marissa Beck, who is the Research Director at the ISSP and who will be the moderator for our session today. Over to you, Marissa.
So nice to be with you today for this session, and we will now be turning to the opening remarks of our three speakers today. Before we do so, just a quick note, there will be a Q&A part to this session later on, and you are very welcome and encouraged to ask your questions. You can put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen while the speakers are speaking already, and so we will try and answer as many audience questions as possible later in the session. So don't be shy, but please only use the Q&A function to submit your questions so that we can actually see them. Our first speaker today is Josephine Ottawa. She is a faculty affiliate with the ISSP and a full professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences, uOttawa. And we look really forward to your opening remarks, Josephine. Over to you.
Thank you. I am delighted to be part of this very important panel to talk about the issues of most significance during this COVID-19. I chose to focus, there are many issues that I have seen that are particularly important in my area of research around health inequities, especially as it affects Canadians of African descent. I choose to focus my remarks on COVID-19 vaccine, because that is one piece that I continue to work closely with community organizations to address. So while the development of COVID-19 vaccine has been a great success, vaccinating people in the world is still a big challenge. But more importantly, here in Canada, gaining and maintaining public trust in the COVID-19 vaccine and vaccination is an equally important part of the equation in this success story of development of vaccine, which still requires us to focus attention, especially on those populations that have been historically marginalized and have other issues that prevent them from having access to vaccine. And I say access in quote because some may say it's hesitancy, but you can also look at it as vaccine access because it then highlights the need for more education. Some people are reluctant to take the vaccine because they do not feel they have enough information to make that decision. And so that is an area that I would build more of my discussion on.
Thank you, Josephine, for highlighting the important issue of vaccination. Next, we will hear from Patrick Fafard, who's a core member of the ISSP and also a full professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa.
Thank you very much. So I want to pick up where Josephine left off and address the question of how do governments, whether it's on vaccination or anything else, actually encourage and engender the trust of the public. And the standard model that governments developed over decades was that on matters of public health, they would employ and roll out what's called here in Ontario, the Chief Medical Officer of Health. It goes by different names. And now we have one for Canada, the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada. And the idea here is that in order to reassure the public that government decision-making is appropriate, the government puts forward a public health expert, a physician, and this person is meant to convey several ideas. One, that the government decision-making is based on the best available evidence. Two, that they're taking advice from physicians in the medical community more broadly. And in previous public health crises, it worked reasonably well. The challenge with the current pandemic is that it is on a scale that is unprecedented and is going on for much longer. And so I want to say a few words about the way in which COVID-19 has put the role of the Chief Medical Officer in tension and at the risk of undermining public trust. So these people, and they are now familiar to us in a way they weren't before. So depending on where you live, you will have heard of Dr. Moore here in Ontario and his predecessor, Dr. Williams. In Quebec, Dr. Arruda is in the media on a regular basis. Dina Hinshaw in Alberta, Bonnie Henry in British Columbia. And of course, every Friday, Theresa Tam, the Chief Public Health Officer for Canada, makes a statement, gives a press conference. And these people, the reason they do this is because governments are using these people to send some messages about what's going on and explain things to the public. And in principle, it works reasonably well. But of course, these people are also senior advisors to their governments they work for. Their job is to be the bringer of the science to the government. And these two ideas, these two roles, that is the public face of the government and the senior advisor of the government, are in tension at the best of times, and during the pandemic, that tension has become manifest and in some places is reaching a crisis. Because if the Chief Medical Officer of Health is asked to be not just the person who explains what's going on, but is asked to go on to defend what's going on. And in those provinces that are slow to bring their policies and programs and choices in line with the best available evidence. So at different times in Canada, the government of Ontario has been in that position, the government of Ontario, the government of Saskatchewan. The Chief Medical Officer finds himself in a rather odd position because they become the spokespersons and they're asked to explain, if not defend, a policy that is, if not indefensible, at least at odds with what their medical and public health colleagues are saying elsewhere. And it's this tension that risks corroding the role of the Chief Medical Officer, which is designed to create trust. And in the medium to long term, the role will have to be rethought because it may have been, in some places, it may have been so damaged that the public will say, well, no, the Chief Medical Officer of Health is merely a spokesman for the governor of the day, which is not the intent. So there's a whole bunch of issues that flow from that in terms of trust and in terms of messaging, but we can get to that a little later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you so much for these thoughtful comments. And I wanted to apologize. I think I cut Josephine off a little bit too early. She wasn't done with her remarks yet. So before actually turning to our third speaker, I'll hand it back to Josephine. And my apologies for that, Josephine. Over to you again.
Okay, thank you. So again, my focus is on the area of my work around ACB health. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as we know, it has had profound impact on the health and social and economic well-being of people in Canada and around the world. And we know that African, Caribbean, and Black communities represent one of the most vulnerable populations in terms of their health risk, the kind of service they receive, the adequacy of that care, and the chance of recovery from COVID. We also know that the burden of COVID-19 mortality and mortality among vulnerable populations such as these translate into greater challenges for healthcare systems through the loss of social capital, productive labor force, and the erosion of racial and cultural equity. And so when we think about this, it is interesting that those disproportionately impacted by COVID infection, such as these ACB people, are also the population with low vaccination rate. And when we think about the reasons for this low vaccination rate, we think about healthcare experiences like the Tuskegee experiment, but also in the Canadian healthcare system, we've had stories of treatment in our healthcare system that also impact on ACB community members. I've done projects in Nova Scotia where women talk about having hysterectomy at a very early age and not understanding why, uninformed surgery. So issues like that also affect the trust of the system, the public trust of the system. Low health and racial literacy, as well as historical lack of access to care and inequities in the care that is available are all reasons why populations, historically marginalized populations like ACB communities have this problem. We also know that the Black community twice have said they like the trust when people from their community actually are part of the messengers of this vaccine and the whole COVID-19 issues. And so we need to be able to have messengers from that community that can relate to it. We've heard it, so there's some evidence in the US that have pointed to that, but even here in Canada, in our local activities, we've had this issue about having people from the community translate this. So some of the work happening locally, the training of local champions from the community to be able to go into the community to carry out this communication related to COVID vaccine. It's one of the strategies that I see that is effective in terms of addressing this, using participatory approaches at issues that are actually strategies that have addressed this. When we talk about vaccine hesitancy or building the community's confidence to accept vaccine and increase the uptake, it's a multi-pronged approach because we are very, very aware of the complexity of the whole issue surrounding not just the vaccine, but the disparities or inequities in health for ACB community. And so we must employ a multi-pronged approach that can use trusted information, the source of information, but also building trust, being honest about the side effect and providing reassurance in terms of the robust vaccine safety system or focusing on the protection of the vaccine recipients and the community, using messages that can tell stories and address related issues in terms of the measures of increasing the vaccine confidence and acceptance in this community is so important. And so we need that critical racial literacy piece so that people can understand the pathways in which race impact on the social determinants of health, including the vulnerability to vaccine, to COVID-19 infection, the comorbidities, the other disease conditions that impact on ACB community that make them more vulnerable to even vaccine infection. I think we need to talk about that trust in vaccine and in the ability of government to communicate and to successfully deliver the vaccination program is critically dependent on the extent to which the government can instill and maintain that public confidence in the effectiveness and safety of the vaccine, but also on the cultural and racial competence of the institutions that deliver those vaccines. The principles and the processes that guide the government decisions and actions in vaccine procurement, distribution, prioritization, and administration need to be clear to the public in order for us to actually increase that confidence in the vaccine. Also, the capacity and effectiveness of the agencies that regulate the handling of this vaccine and communication need to be something that is used to maintain that public confidence in the processes of the vaccine. And so in all, I see a very important role that community can play, and Patrick has touched on some of those, where we need the community to be part of these processes so that they can have shared ownership of the process. They can have people within the community that are part of the communication team, part of those developing the messages that go in, so that cultural and racial competence is an integral part of that. Fairness is also a key part on how we change behavior. If we have a group that have historically not been treated fairly and so has this mistrust of the system, then we need to treat them with fairness in order for them to begin to understand the system and build that social cohesion and trust. So I would stop there. Thank you.
Thank you again, Josephine, for these additional comments. Thank you.
Yeah.
Finally, our third speaker, Maxime Lay, who is a public health project officer with Ottawa Public Health. He's also the principal at Lay & Co Consultants. And moreover, he recently graduated with a master's degree in communication from the University of Ottawa, and he specialized in science, society, and policy through the ISSP's collaborative master's program. So we're very happy to welcome back a recent graduate, and Maxime, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Marissa, for the introduction. I just perhaps one bit of clarification. I did graduate this year, and in fact, my thesis was on online anti-vaccine argumentation here in Canada. So I was very lucky in the misfortune of the pandemic that my research was timely and needed. And every day I learn lots about how to communicate about vaccination. Hopefully, I can share some of those lessons learned here today. I guess in particular, I'll start with my remarks about how some people tend to say, though, is this like a new phenomenon, right? Is anti-vaccination perhaps a mistrust in authority during the pandemic? Is this kind of new? But no, not necessarily. In fact, well, science communication has pretty much always been poor. So if science had a PR person, I would fire them a long time ago, because they don't really do a good job in establishing trust in between the organizations that speak on science and the people that science interacts with. An example of this is that when vaccines were invented, they were invented back in 1796. Back then, anti-vaccination actually appeared before vaccines were invented. So how could that be? Well, that's because before vaccines were invented, there was something called, variolation. There were various techniques across the world that, scientists or doctors tried to do to try and prevent smallpox. But unfortunately, the techniques that they used were, first of all, pretty gross, invasive, and they didn't really seem to work. They seemed to propagate the disease they were meant to prevent. And so when vaccination was invented, which was based on that sort of principle of inoculation, already there was that mistrust, because people were like, well, that doesn't work. How can we expect this new technology to work? And we've seen sort of that same sentiment echo here with the mRNA vaccines. I can think of another example. In the 60s, maybe not related to vaccination, but in the 60s here in Canada, United States, thalidomide was approved for marketing purposes. Thalidomide was widely, promoted and stuff like that. But unfortunately, as we may know, thalidomide poisoning had disastrous effects on the health and safety of women and children. Across Canada and the US. And then eventually the government's, okay, well, this is enough, let's pull it off the shelves. But in the beginning, the government had to approve that sort of marketing, had to approve that sort of communication. So something went wrong there, and there was that precedent of distrust. So why would people trust an authority that's supposed to keep them safe when it actually did not? Another point on this is maybe echoed in more recent months, or especially in the early days of the pandemic. There was the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, so NACI, when they were at first giving out their guidance. They said, okay, well, according to our best available evidence that's emerging, our best available data, yes, you can take this, that, or whatever vaccine. I can think of especially the AstraZeneca vaccine. They said, okay, this is good to go. But then shortly after, maybe a month or two after the announcement, you saw some provinces turn their backs and say, well, we're going to pause, administration of first dose of AstraZeneca vaccine. And now Canada is actually shipping those doses out to other countries where vaccination needs are having to be met. So we had something like 40,000 people that took the AstraZeneca vaccine in the first place, and like, hang on, you told me that this was safe to take. I trusted the science. I trusted the government that that said this was okay. And then all of a sudden, you're turning your back. You're saying, no, never mind. This is not okay. We're gonna halt it. And then what am I supposed to feel that way? Worse, I'm supposed to feel betrayed, confused. So a lot of emotional, experiences that people had throughout this pandemic that were mimicked long ago that re-echoed here today. Another thing I can point out is that public health authorities have always been seen to, promote, technocracy, right? That top-down decision-making. And in fact, back in the days, 1800s, whatnot, when the first vaccines actually came out, were invented, public health authorities had enforcers. It was it wasn't as rosy as it is today that public health units are. They actually had enforcers. If people would beat like non-compliers with sticks and batons and imprison people if they didn't comply with public health measures. So already there you have that public perception where this big government or like big public health is trying to harm me if I don't listen to them. So that sows that mistrust, and naturally that distrust persisted, and even it is here today. And finally, I guess I can echo Dr. Ottawa's pieces about building community and making sure that communication about science, about public health, about vaccination is tailored and is by and for the communities that will receive those sorts of communications. And when you do that, you build trust from the bottom up instead of, top down, as we are so used to. So of course, it's easier said than done, right? You can communicate about pandemic measures, about vaccination, mass comms, things like that. They work, but to a certain extent, and they're not foolproof. They're not going to reach everyone. So what you need is these local community-based messaging by going to do some outreach to leaders of opinion, to people that are already trusted members of those communities. You can train them on how to talk about vaccines, on public health communication, on these pro public health messages, so that they in turn can go back to their communities, back to their friends, colleagues, neighbors, and spread the good word about vaccination, for example. And actually, this technique is what anti-vaxxers use. And this is something I learned throughout my thesis. So anti-vaxxers, what they'll do is, they'll go up to people. They say, I'm not here to pretend to be a scientist or a doctor, or I don't have all the answers. But what I do have is that I am just like you. I'm your everyday average Canadian. I'm your neighbor. I have your best interest at heart. I'm just like you. I listen to the news. I make sure to do my own research. But you know what? I also share your fears and worries and concerns about vaccination. I don't think those vaccines are all the fuss they're made out to be about. I'm concerned that they were approved so fast, etc. So maybe we should be concerned about that. Or maybe we should be concerned that these authorities are trying to impose this on us or take away our freedoms, our medical liberty. Does that kind of make sense? And when you have that sort of, local approach, organic approach, people are like, yeah, okay, that kind of makes sense. And you develop that sense of community right away. And that's how anti-vaxxers are able to grow in such numbers, is because they do that organic outreach. They establish relationships of trust where governments are lacking and use those. So what can we do? Ultimately, public health authorities, scientific authorities, they could try and take a page out of the anti-vaccine playbook and develop communities from the ground up using similar tactics to influence people and develop trust. So thank you, and looking forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you, Maxime, for these really insightful comments and a bit of history behind it as well. So we have time for some Q&A and some discussion with the audience as well. And I can see the first questions are coming in. So please keep them coming. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions to the panelists. I will use my position as the moderator now to kick off the conversation and to ask my first questions. I'd be really interested. We've heard about a lot of issues and challenges that we've been facing with public trust during COVID and the pandemic. I would like to hear the speakers comment a little bit on kind of the bottom line. Like, at this point, is public confidence in expertise weaker or stronger as a result of the pandemic? And where do you see confidence going over the next months and years? In the context of the pandemic, but maybe also in a bit of a broader sense. And can you identify any opportunities that this crisis, this public health crisis that we're experiencing, is possibly offering to better rebuild public trust in expertise? So I'd be really interested to hear the speakers' comments, and whoever wants to go first.
I'll go first. It's both a simple question and a huge question. So first, the good news. Public opinion surveys show that Canadians continue to have high levels of trust in, depending how you phrase the question, in scientists, in science. So this is pretty hardwired into our culture. And even during the pandemic, those numbers have moved around a bit, but they continue to be high. When you ask a more specific question, do you have trust in the messaging you receive from government? Then the numbers are quite different, and public trust has slowly ebbed over the last 18 months. However, if you go even further and you distinguish between who's speaking, as it were, Canadians continue to have relatively high levels of trust in public health writ large. So the public health community has managed, by and large, to retain a certain degree of public confidence and public trust. I'll give you one strong indication of that is even though Dina Hinshaw, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Health in Alberta, is much pilloried and there are people calling for her resignation, there are actually other people who say, well, no, we actually have to give her more authority, which tells you something about people's trust in her. Now, a couple of caveats. This is broad level data. So in this panel, we've been talking about subsections of the population. We don't actually have good data on what people at a regional or sub-provincial level, and we certainly don't have good data on these kinds of questions for marginalized populations, for people who are not vaccinated versus people who are vaccinated. So in some sense, there's a whole bunch we don't know yet about the trends in public trust in science and in public health science. I guess the final thing I'd say is we have to also be very careful in terms of what we recommend. There is this common refrain that says, well, it's because the government's messaging is confused. I think what we've learned during the pandemic is the public's ability to understand messaging is highly, highly variable. I have friends and family whose expertise is by no means public health, and they know they've taught themselves enormous amounts. So there are some publics who are incredibly well informed. Conversely, there are some publics who don't have a clue and don't want to have a clue. And so when we say that, the messaging has to be consistent and simple and consistent across the country, I don't think that's desirable or true. You need to tailor your message to local populations. So I'm not much fussed if there's dissonance between the message from one provincial government to another. In fact, I think that's actually a strength because they're trying to tailor their messaging to their own provinces. But there's much, much more research to be done here. And there's a whole lot we're gonna have to do a retrospective and ask in a systematic way what worked and what didn't work.
Thank you. Josephine, Maxime, comments from you. Are we overall better or worse off with public confidence in expertise? And are there any opportunities that are coming out of this current situation or this crisis situation?
Thank you. So I would say, again, it would depend on the level. Because when we're talking about complex issues surrounding public trust, we acknowledge that these issues impact the individual person, it impacts on communities, and then there are the systemic or structural level barriers. And so when I'm talking about public trust, I can see where people are concerned about vaccine even at the individual level. But I can also see trust being gained around some of the systemic changes we're seeing. In the ACB community, I see more and more resources naming racism, naming structural racism, and resources being put to address it. Funding organizations such as the Canadian Institute of Health Research now actually has a requirement for lead investigators to complete their modules online, whether it's implicit bias or the gender and diversity lens to be able to look at some of these issues. We see a number of organizations having the EDI strategy to begin to look at issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I think I see that as one of the strengths or silver lining that the pandemic has brought to us, that we now have a shared language between government, organization, and communities in terms of naming the issue of anti-Black structural and systemic racism. It's been able to expose some of the inequities that previously we could not talk about. We've known about the social determinants of health for decades. We fought so hard to have race to be recognized as one of those determinants, and now we're sitting at tables where these issues are named. We have a shared language to name this issue, and hopefully this momentum continues. So I see that as one of the areas where we've gained some trust, public trust, because we are now looking at systemic changes.
That's fascinating. Maxime, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I guess for me, I would say again, people have asked, is public trust at an all-time low or all-time high or whatnot? And I'd say it's I guess par for the course or like status quo. Canada has at least historically had kind of a quiet level of public trust in science and authority. In fact, in 2015, if I recall correctly, there was a survey that found that 95% of Canadians had belief in vaccination and went to get themselves and their kids vaccinated against childhood diseases and whatnot. So that was pretty astounding. And in 2018, it was found that around 2 to 5% of the Canadian population, which back then represented something like between 750,000 to 2 million Canadians, said that they were either vaccine hesitant or anti-vax. So 2 to 5%, it's can be quite big, but in contrast to the rest of the overall population is quite marginal. So will that change with this pandemic? I'm not sure. We'll have to, like Professor Fafard said, we'll have to do retrospective studies and see how that will play out. But I guess in terms of opportunities, and I'll echo Professor Itowa's comments as well. In 2020, the CPHO, the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, released a report on COVID-19 and inequity. Right, it revealed lots of inequities, not only in, that was before vaccines were even in Canada, but in the healthcare systems that that serve people. So the fact that it helped reveal inequity, or not necessarily reveal them, but shone a light to more people on inequity, I think that's a good silver lining. And if we can make sure that communities are represented, their voices are represented on panels or decisions that involve them, nothing about us without us, right? That could be something good to go moving forward, good to implement as a policy.
Great, thank you, Maxime. That actually leads nicely into the next audience questions that I would like to pose to the panelists now. And I'm just going to read it out here. Throughout the webinar, the presenters mentioned the factors that support or erode public trust. However, what I did not hear is how engagement with the public enhances public trust. So emergency management research has demonstrated that engaging with the public and utilizing public input enhances public trust. In contrast, a top-down approach like we used during COVID diminishes public trust. So is there a way to utilize public input during pandemics to enhance trust? And I think maybe what this audience member and what I personally also would be interested in, maybe some like practical examples or some practical ideas of how can that public input actually be implemented in practice, or maybe has it been practiced and implemented in some ways already? I'd be very interested to hear the speakers' views on that. So Maxime, you seem like you're ready to go on this one. I'm going to ask all three speakers to comment, but Maxime, why don't we start off with you?
Yeah, sure. I guess the way I would approach this is, deliberate design of communications plans or products. And when you engage someone, make it not be tokenistic, right? And in another life, I'm also a patient advisor here at the Ottawa Hospital. And I represent the voices of patients on research projects. But for a long time, patient advisors they didn't really have a concrete voice in their own healthcare or health decision making. And it was very tokenistic. There were some projects that I was involved on just so that the researchers can check a box, right, and say, oh yeah, we've engaged patients. But if you meaningfully engage people and get their feedback, get their honest feedback, and take their feedback at heart, and make changes to what you were going to make by listening to people, then that's a much more genuine connection you build with people, and you therefore establish trust between that person. They can say, oh yeah, I trust this project manager, this communications officer, because they listen to me to listen to my concerns. And if you do that for specific communities, and if you co-develop and co-design communications products that are buy-in for those communities, I think that's much more successful than just even saying you have like a draft in the first place and you go for feedback. No, instead of having a draft in the first place, go to these communities and build your comms products, build your plan, build a strategy from the ground up, from the get-go, from scratch with these communities, and not in tokenistic fashion. Hopefully that helps.
Josephine, Patrick, who wants to go next on this one?
I can go. So I would like to build on the comment of Maxine, that again, working with community right from the beginning, they're not brought in at a later stage. Like we already said, one shoe size does not fit all. So it's a multi-pronged approach, but one approach we've been using here in Ottawa and some of my colleagues here in Ontario is the use of peer-led modules. How can we use peers in the community to convey this message? How can they be trained? So training them both on health literacy programs to target the health information and the messaging in ways that can be taken up in those venues where we find more people, whether it's in their churches, in their mosques, in faith-based organizations, partnering with faith-based organizations so that those peers can also be people who are already out there advocating for issues. They have platforms that they can reach many people, and now we're training them on critical literacy. How do we look at issues of race and the historical context of race relations and the trauma that slavery has created in the Black community, the mental health issues, and how these are linked to some of the decisions around this, so that people actually going in to train or talk about vaccine are not only talking about vaccine, we're training them on how they can talk about the whole social determinants of health piece. So that peer equity navigators talk about equity issues and situate the vaccine within that as one way to help people understand the multiple pathways in which these health inequities exist in the community. So I think programs that work directly with community and is planned with government and with resources to be able to use the community to convey that message is one way that I see that. And again, it's informed by intersectionality lens, an approach that understands that it's not one thing, it's not only race, it could be gender, poverty, and all the other social demographics that intersect to create that compounding issues that we're dealing with. And when community people can understand that even in their own way, then I think it makes a difference.
Maxime and Josephine have talked for the most part about public input at the sort of cliff face, at the operational level. And this is critically important. And a lot of what they described is critically useful, and we're learning a lot. But the question can be shifted a bit and ask about how do we engender public trust, not in sort of what's happening in our communities to increase vaccination, for example, but rather public trust or confidence in the macro decisions to do a lockdown in a particular way, to extend vaccine mandates or whatever. And this is a different challenge. Here, seeking and getting public input is more complicated. There is a sort of idealistic view that is becoming more common as the pandemic wears on and public patience or confidence in what their elected governments are doing declines. People are essentially saying something that goes like, my government is not doing a particularly good job. Clearly, my government, the existing system is not good. We need to go experiment with other forms of public input into these macro decisions. And while in principle, that's a wonderful idea, what we know about democratic deliberation, and there's lots of experiments in Canada and elsewhere, is it takes a long time, it's complicated. And at the end of the day, you have to ask the question, who are these people that are deliberating? What accountability and legitimacy do they have? So it seems to me that going forward, we have to answer the question, what role do we want existing democratic institutions to play? And did they play their role in a particularly good, effective way during the pandemic? And here, the Canadian experience is very different from the experience of other countries. And so in Canada, with a few exceptions, there have been relatively few discussions in legislatures about the overall management of the pandemic. So 2 days ago, a major report was issued in the United Kingdom generating extraordinary criticism and evaluation of the government's handling of the pandemic, particularly at the beginning. We've had very little of that in Canada. One of the ways in which you engender public trust is you reflect back to the public the fact that even those folks over there in government disagree, or my concern about X is actually being voiced. Where we live, where we're sitting now in Canada, it's like this uniform set of messaging. And people kind of go, well, I'm not hearing myself or the concerns of me, my friends, my community. So one retrospective that we need to think about is, could we, should we, might we copy the experience of other countries and foster a conversation even in the middle of the pandemic? There's been a little bit of that at the federal level using the House of Commons Standing Committee, but not very much. But in the medium to longer term, it's a much bigger and more complicated question. Because what we've learned is there is, at least at some level, a tension between expert advice or expert views and public views. There's this claim out there that the experts and the public are at loggerheads. Reconciling those two things is hugely, hugely important. And if I can do a plug for my own research, and if the potential funders are listening, I've developed a research project with colleagues in Scotland and in Finland to address exactly this question. That can we innovate in terms of our institutions to create spaces where the expert view and the public view are brought together and are reconciled? And so some of what Maxime and Josephine have been talking about is vitally important because we need to find ways to increase trust of communities who don't understand the government, don't really care. All they know now is, oh my goodness, the government can make choices that severely affect me. So we need to figure out ways to create a conversation and reconcile these two views. Now, the good news is that we have lots of experience in this, both in Canada and around the world. And it is possible to bring experts and citizens together in deliberative fora. And the general public has an amazing ability to learn and understand and participate actively and responsibly in reconciling these things that are hard to reconcile. And so we're probably going to need to do, as part of the post-mortems, do some of that deliberative work so that it's something a bit more sophisticated than just shouting each other from our existing positions.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And actually, kind of picking up on something you just said, another question from the audience came in, encouraging us maybe to rethink of who we call an expert or who we should, how experts, the audience member put it in quotation marks even. So I'm just going to read that question because I think it links up nicely to where the discussion is right now. So trust and expertise depends on who one recognizes as expert. So how do we ensure that future health methods take this into consideration and make room for groups, experts and leaders to advocate for their communities? And I think some of Josephine's comments have spoken to that when she talked about having peers in the community, doing some messaging, but maybe that question of who's the expert and who is there a need to reconfigure, redefine our ideas of an expert? Are there any comments from?
Why don't I lead off? A recurring theme in the work of the ISSP is this variations on this question, which is who gets to bring what expertise to the table to make decisions. And so when you talk about, well, the government needs to engage in evidence-based policy, a term which is nonsensical, but leaving that to one side, sometimes you get an argument that says, yeah, we need to, bring different kinds of expertise and different perspectives. We need to make a distinction here between scientific and technical expertise, which is what we normally think of when we use the word expert, and knowledge of my community and what my community needs. The first is by and large based on scientific research. The second is much more normative and much more cultural, if you will, which isn't to say that it's not important, on the contrary, but the ways in which we bring it to bear on decision-making is quite a bit different. So it seems to me we need to create fora. So I would much prefer a world in which we say, we don't try and make everybody an expert in one little thing, that we reserve the word expert for its conventional decision, but we create other spaces to bring other non-scientific considerations to bear. But here's the kicker. Guess what? They're going to conflict. They're not going to align. And so this is where democratic government comes in. What's politics? Politics is the way in our society we come to make decisions when we disagree. And we clearly, the pandemic has shown that there are vocal minorities who actively and vociferously disagree with some of what governments have chosen to do. It's not a matter of ignoring them and wish they'd go away, but it's a matter of creating spaces where the conversation can be joined. But at the end of the day, you got to decide. Which brings me just to my final comment. Let's all remember, this is all happening in real time, day by day. We're engaged in a form of crisis management. So of course it's lumpy, imperfect, and they get it wrong. They're human. Let's all just take a deep breath here, which isn't to say we couldn't do better. It's to say that we're doing as best we can under very strange circumstances, but hopefully we'll learn the lessons and we can build structures that are more inclusive. But at the end of the day, I think it's our elected officials who have to make these tough decisions.
Thank you. Josephine, would you like to respond to that? I know you had brought up that idea of the peer, I forget the exact term that you used, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the expert. Who do we recognize as the expert here?
I think Patrick did state it in terms of two levels of expertise, or two kinds of expertise. The indigenous knowers of their own knowledge and experiences are experts in that field, and they bring that. So how can we create that common space where that kind of knowledge is seen as equally important? So as we bring research evidence, we bring in that kind of expert knowledge into the conversation and use that in constructing the change we need to see, the policy we need to see right from the beginning. So individual experiences are important information that needs to be part of that equation. And so there may be different kinds of experts, but they're equally important, and Patrick said that.
Thanks. Maxime, thoughts from you on that question?
Yeah, I think what I would propose is that when we have these experts with the technical knowledge, the scientific knowledge, I think it would also be good to use other kinds of that expertise, that more like social, cultural expertise, to help interpret that science, that knowledge, to make it make sense to their own communities. Because if you have this big scientific this document or research that requires a lot of scientific literacy to understand and interpret, well, you can therefore it might not be as accessible to everyone, right? So when you have these people with lived experiences with a particular project or whatnot that could bring their own perspectives, they could hopefully then understand the science, the expertise that's being brought, and reinterpret that for their own communities, their own family members, whatnot, to make sure the message is clear and consistent and brought across. But of course, we have to be careful that that message does not get changed or misinterpreted, of course. But we have to work with these communities to make sure that they do understand what that science means to them and how it can benefit them, how it can impact them, especially.
Thank you. I just have one quick comment to add to that again. I think actually it's, the messaging that you just talked about is key, but even in the creation of that science, there is a different perspective that the community members bring to that table, even in terms of how we interpret data. I'll give you an example. Recently, it's actually a COVID project, and that we completed this survey. And then we have the epidemiologists and others looking at this and cleaning the data. In the process of cleaning, they're removing certain answers. So if somebody refuses to answer or says no to a particular question, they have a different way of interpreting that. That's their standard. And community members are saying, no, because I did not answer, or does not mean that I don't use healthcare. It just means that I don't feel that I feel okay. When you said, no, I don't use the healthcare services, it does not mean that you don't have healthcare needs. It means you're afraid to go because you'll be judged. There's so many other things. So it's not that you have no need for the service, but that you feel you'll be judged. So it will be helpful if people can give them opportunity to explain why they say no to a particular question. And some of those nuances are picked when you have those community expert advisory groups, and you bring data to share it and say, no, I will not clean that out because it has more meaning for us than what you're saying. So we do need them even in the creation of the science, or we may be interpreting things differently.
Thank you. Thank you. We have talked a lot about kind of local approaches and diversifying different approaches and different communication to different communities. We actually have a question here from the audience that is looking at the more global picture, and specifically, is the perception of public health in Canada too strongly linked to the WHO? And do Canada's agreements with the WHO, with the World Health Organization, deliver a trust advantage? So I'd be interested if our speakers, if you have comments on that kind of more global perspective, and Canada being part of that global organization and that relationship and how it affects public trust in Canada. Who wants to take a first step at that one?
Why don't I start?
Sure.
One of the ways in which public trust conventionally and traditionally is enhanced is if a government can say, I'm doing this because I'm following the best available science. And as we've discovered in the last hour, that works for some populations and not so well for others. But for a lot of people, that kind of makes a difference. And so then the question is, well, which science or which group of scientists or who are you listening to? And so most of the people here today will remember that, of course, early on during the pandemic, when governments were scrambling and everyone was scrambling to understand what the heck was going on, we all did what we're supposed to do, which is turn to the WHO, which was designed to be, at least in the short term, the repository of what we know. And our governments would say, well, we're following the guidance issued by the World Health Organization. And just so we're not incredibly parochial, in low and middle income countries, this is absolutely critical because those countries may not have the reservoir of expertise that we have in a high-income country like Canada. So WHO is critically important. So then the question became, well, who are these people? What is the WHO anyway? And we all became very knowledgeable very fast. And unfortunately, a couple of things happened. One, a series of WHO decisions were deemed controversial. For example, why did they take so long to declare this to be a public health emergency of international concern? Well, there's some technical reasons for that, which I won't go into. Or why was the WHO so slow to say we all should be wearing masks? Once again, there are a whole bunch of reasons that I won't go into, but it wasn't quite as silly as it might seem from a distance. Of greater concern to me was how the WHO became a bit of a political football, at least in the United States. And so there was a sort of a meme, an argument floating around out there that said something like, the WHO is too subservient to the government of China, and then President Trump said as much, and somehow the WHO is not a neutral body and is just doing things at the behest of the government of China. Well, first of all, that's just poppycock, it's just wrong. But second, it is a way, it's a reminder that on things that divide us, our critics will throw pot shots at scientists if they think they can advance their arguments. They don't have to be good arguments, they have to be compelling arguments. But if I don't like what my government is doing and my government says, well, I'm basing it on the science, well, then I start attacking this. If I'm really, really concerned and don't play the game by the established rules, I'll start attacking the scientists or their organizations. This in the medium to long term is very corrosive. We have to figure out a way of arresting this phenomenon because it's bad in any number of levels. But by and large, as we moved into the pandemic, you heard less and less about the WHO because governments in Canada developed their own ability, their own expertise. But the WHO continues to be critically important because the way the system is designed, everything is supposed to feed into Geneva and they're supposed to try and make sense of it all. And there are things that even the best and most resourced governments can't keep track of. The Centers for Disease Control in the US, the WHO, and maybe 2 or 3 organizations in the world can actually claim to keep keeping track of this stuff. So we are deeply reliant on them. Doesn't mean we have to follow what they say, just means we have to make sure that they're funded appropriately and that we are aware of what they're saying. And for some audiences, it makes a difference. I dare say most of our friends and neighbors don't know what the WHO is and don't much care. So we should be careful not to rely on it too much.
Thank you, Patrick. Josephine, Maxime, do you have additions to that?
Well said, no.
Exactly. I think your Professor Fafard hit the nail on the head.
Great, wonderful. For maybe our last question, we're slowly nearing the end of this session. I would like to come back to something that Josephine has actually mentioned in her comments, and that is that relationship between trust and expertise and inequity, and how the COVID pandemic has maybe unmasked, no pun intended, or exposed some of those linkages. And I'd be really interested to hear a bit more from our speakers about that intersection and kind of what we've learned through COVID and how that momentum that Josephine has described, where actually we have created a lot of awareness and some measures have been encouraged by the pandemic to address these more systemic issues, how that momentum can maybe be sustained at this point in the crisis. And yeah, just a few more thoughts on that interlinkage, which I find very interesting.
Let me say a few words at the high macro level, but I'm sure my other panelists will have much to say. So just a couple of preliminary comments. It's not like we discovered health inequality during the pandemic. It's well understood, it's well known. We have the data that shows quite dramatic health inequality, inequity in countries around the world, including here in Canada. So that's not new. Second, while they didn't draw attention to it, the government of Canada, for one, knew from the beginning that there was a very real possibility that the effect of the pandemic would be felt unevenly across populations. What we discovered, however, is that we didn't necessarily have the data. So we couldn't actually, because we were too polite as Canadians, we won't ask you about your racial, ethnic, cultural, religious background. Well, no, actually, we need to have that data, because without that, we can't actually understand fully the effects of the pandemic. But I guess the broader statement is the pandemic has simply revealed that which already existed and drawn attention to it. And it's that drawing attention to it that could be one of the silver linings in a dark cloud, that we, if we're skilled, we could have an ongoing conversation about health inequality. Whether we can actually pull that off, I don't know.
I think for me, if I can add to that comment, is that perhaps we need, as we emerge from the pandemic in the future, we need more representativity in public decision-making bodies, whether it be in scientific decision-making bodies, policy, governance, whatnot. Just more representativity in general would increase those levels of trust, and just by having a diversity on a panel like this, or even on future, employment boards and stuff like that. It would go a long way in making sure people see themselves reflected, see their cultures, their neighbors reflected inside these decision-making bodies. Would help sustain that trust that we have fought so hard to maintain, or at least build, or even reestablish or establish in the first place.
Thank you. And I'll just add to that as well, that to sustain this, we need to create changes at the deep root level, the values that actually sustain some of these issues, the systemic barriers we're talking about, are anchored in organizational values, in individual values that we've come to recognize in society, in terms of what we can and cannot discuss. So I'm hoping that the open discussion, the drawing attention to these issues now, can be sustained by changes in those values that run organization. And we can see that then manifesting in equity hiring, inclusive workplaces, and hopefully all the organizations that now have funding and are developing programs can actually use that to change, to create change. We are all talking about race-based data, disaggregated race-based data. We have to talk about how that can be actually governed, so it's not used to then further marginalize people. How do we protect this race-based data we're collecting? How is it governed, and how is it used to actually implement policy changes, practice changes, and even more research that can highlight these issues or give us tools to address them? I'm hoping we can sustain that. And I'm hoping that the creation of Black-led organizations or racialized community BIPOC people-led organizations can help to hold us accountable to those values and the things we're doing now, so that when COVID-19, this particular pandemic ends, we do not see those programs folding up, that we actually have people that can hold us accountable to continue the momentum of this work.
Thank you so much, Josephine. I think that's an excellent last comment to close our discussion today. We're running out of time, unfortunately. I'm sure we could keep on speaking about these important questions and issues for much longer, but it is my honor to thank all of our wonderful speakers today. Thank you all so much, Patrick, Josephine, and Maxime, for joining us today and for this really rich and insightful discussion. I would also like to thank the ISSP team, my colleagues, in particular, Brendan Frank and Raphael Desardi, without whom this session would not have been possible. Thank you both so much. And thank you in the audience for attending today's sessions and for interacting with us through your questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get to every single question, but I hope your most burning questions were answered in today's session. If you would like to review this session, because there was so much rich information delivered, you can do so on our YouTube channel. This session has been recorded and will be available as a video later on. It's also my pleasure to announce the next Food for Thought event, which will actually happen in 2 weeks' time. So back to the regular schedule last Thursday of the month. So you can be with us again on October 28th. A speaker will be Chibuke Udenikwe. He's a faculty affiliate of the ISSP and also a full professor in the School of Nutrition Sciences and the Faculty of Health Sciences. And Chibuke will be speaking about the sustainability of global food systems, all the aspects in which they are maybe not fully sustainable right now and what can be done to make them more sustainable. Moderator for that session will be Kelly Bronson, who is an ISSP core member and also a Canadian Research Chair in Science and Society here at the ISSP. She's also assistant professor at the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences. As usual, please visit our website or follow us on social media to stay up to date on all ISSP publications and events. And we look forward to welcoming you again soon. Once again, thanks to our outstanding speakers today. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.